Operator Syndrome, episode 55. That's a nice number. Um, we're still talking about Steve, going through his timeline here. When we wrapped up, you were doing well, um, uh, doing all the right things that usually makes for a good transition. You're in school, you're enjoying it. That's always helpful to enjoy whatever you're doing. You're doing the jujitsu thing. Um, things are looking great. Making some money. Things are looking
Yeah.
great. Um, so how does that school experience wrap up? Anything of note happen during school, or pretty much you just crushed it and then moved on to the next thing?
Yeah, I did really well at school. It just, I mean, I worked hard. That's a pretty simple formula. Yeah, I succeeded at it. It was very satisfying to me. I guess the part of that story too is that I yeah, I was a fairly new Christian um, at Christianity, and I was serious about my faith when I was in the SEAL teams, but I got real serious when I got out. I like to study. I like to study the Bible. I like to read books about the Bible, and that was very meaningful to me. And I was a part of a church that asked me to be a Sunday school teacher for like the young adults group, and I did pretty well at that. Felt we had a good group, and they liked me. I liked them. We had a lot of fun just trying to figure out Christianity and how we play a role in this nutty world. And so my faith was really important to me. I mean, it still is, but it's like you go through phases. I always call it my honeymoon with Jesus phase, where I was really excited and I'm bright eyed. And um, anyway, so that gave me a lot of meaning,
Hmm.
as faith gives a lot of people a lot of meaning. It's a good thing. It can be a good thing. It can go sideways sometimes too. But I have all kinds of thoughts on that. But yeah, just living out my faith, teaching at the church as well as teaching jujitsu, and so I was busy. I mean, I was very busy, which I tend to like to be. I mean, I like to be doing something that's meaningful and something productive.
Hmm.
I don't like to sit around a whole lot. I get that gets me down.
Hmm.
So yeah, I was getting toward the end of my education. I didn't know where I was going to go, what I was going to do next. There were two things that I was considering seriously. One is the ministry and seminary, which is the path I chose. I can talk about, and the other was law. I was going to go to law school, or thinking about going to law school. Took my LSAT, did real well on that, and I got a few scholarship offers. I actually started applying to some law schools, um, but I took a course. It was funny. I was talking about my undergrad. The only course I made a B in all of my undergrad was a law school course. Why
Hmm.
on earth I took that course, I don't know. It was my first semester, and I took a law course, which is at the law school. I mean, it's a graduate course. I somehow got into it and got like elective credits for it.
Interesting.
Weird. Why would I do that? Right? It was very hard. And but anyway, uh in that class called legal research, they taught us how legal citation works in a court, and in the legal system, and it was very complex. But we had to go to the law library and look up all kinds of cases. I mean, federal cases, state statutes, all this, and it was just. By the time I got through that course, I'm like, "Is this what the career in law is going to be?" And the
Mm.
answer is, "Yeah."
Mm.
And, I mean, not all of it, but I was thinking I'm going to be Perry Mason in the courtroom, and had this idea that it'd be sexy, like the Lincoln lawyer or something. Well, I just decided to go the ministry route,
Yeah.
because I just seemed more interested in that. That seems to be my life. It's just I go where I'm interested, and if I'm not, eh, I don't. I guess it's like that for a lot of people, but there's nothing I can't. The thing that drives me really crazy is just running out of interest in something. I'm always curious. I always want to learn something new.
Had when if you decided on the ministry was maybe the way forward in those early days, had you thought about chaplain? Uh, wasn't it chaplaincy? Is that a word?
Chaplaincy. Yeah.
Chaplaincy. Was that something that came across your mind at all, or not at all at that point?
Never entered my mind at that point.
Okay.
I never
Okay.
even really gave it much thought. I might have thought about it, but I don't think I did.
Mm.
It was like just I knew it was there. I knew what it was, but
Hmm.
it didn't appeal to me in any way.
Before we move further, so you're in school, you're doing that thing. At any point while you were thinking about what the next steps were, did you think about did the military come up at all, or do you feel like at that point you felt like you'd close the door on that?
I was done. I was
Yeah.
100% done with it. It didn't even enter my mind at that point.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then
Um.
we'll come back around to that
Sure.
when I get back to my in a couple more episodes later. But yeah. So I was headed to seminary. I took a course in Hebrew, the Hebrew language, in as an undergrad as well. That was another hard course. They didn't teach it at NKU because who studies Hebrew? Well, people either going into rabbinic studies to be rabbis or Christian ministers who the reason you have to study Hebrew and Greek, the Old Testament, what we call Christians call the Old Testament, um, is written in Hebrew. It's the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and it's the same Bible. But the Jews have just the one book they call the Tanakh, the Torah, Naviim, Ketuvim, which is it's the law, the prophets, and the writings. And we just call it the Old Testament, Genesis to through Malachi, those
Hmm.
books. So you got to learn Hebrew to study it in the original language. It's like if you were going to be a French literature professor, you have to learn French, so you can,
Yeah.
you don't want to read Proust in translation. I mean, you can, but it's like that a scholar, it's going into more of a scholarly approach. Like you want to look at the original sources because what we have as Bibles or in English are just all translations. It wasn't
Hmm.
written in, and the New Testament was written in Greek.
Sure. Which have subjective interpretations, and if you're going to be a scholar, you need to have your own interpretation.
Don't get me started on interpretations because I've seen some out there that drive me buggers. They're just wrong. They're just bad. They're just an axe to grind agenda behind them. And I get fired up about it because I'm like, that's not dealing with the text correctly, in my humble opinion. I mean, there's some great translations that nail it, but there's some that I'm just like, how? I guess the reason it gets me kind of fired up is because I don't like people having the wool pulled over their eyes for any reason.
Sure, yeah.
And so sometimes in a Bible translation, amazing thing, a Bible translation is an amazing thing because you usually deal with a whole committee of scholars, uh, Hebrew scholars, Greek scholars who do different books. They translate different books, and then the committee decides and rules on what goes in and what stays out. But those committees sometimes are put together by groups that have theological agendas, right?
Sure. Of course. Yeah.
All kinds. And the good ones, the best ones, in my opinion, are done by interdenominational committees, so that there's a check and balance on running a grinding an axe that's theological, because you can
Sure.
do it all the time. It happens all the time. And this is why, I mean, I've talked to my family a little. Sometimes I'm terrible to ask Bible questions to because I'm gonna blow it up, and I'm gonna say, oh well, so you've heard that, huh, in church? Well, let me show you something. And then they're just like, well, pastor never told us that. I'm like, well, no, right. So it drives it's a love-hate relationship with religion for me because I love it in one sense, it's dear to me, but I also see it misused a lot. And I see people, the result at the end of the day is some people are miserable because they've been raised in a really narrow, harsh, mean-spirited way in Christianity. It doesn't have to be that way, and I hate it when it is. But and in every world religion, I teach a course on world religions at the university. Every world religion has its good and its bad, has its the best of its theology and the worst of its theology, and so it can always go in what I call the fundamentalist direction, which is all right. Now we're cracking heads and we're calling the good from the bad, and we there's not a lot of love in it. There's a lot of meanness. So there's so much, I could go on. I mean, this is my subject. I teach in some of my specialties, so I'll go off on theological tangents. So I got to just back off.
It's clear that there's a lot of passion there, and that's what drove you um to pursue that career field. Um,
I think it's
uh,
this. I think it's my hatred of bullies because that's why I got in the SEAL teams. I
mhm,
didn't like bullies, and no, whether that's a good outlet to do it or not, it's beside the point. But I don't like people at a disadvantage being taken advantage of by somebody who is a bully, who has more power. I don't like it, and I see it. I see it happen, not physically but emotionally in religious context sometimes, and I don't like it. I don't like any kind of bullying, psychological, religious,
mhm.
physical. Um, so that's why I get kind of fired up about it. It comes from I like to think it comes from a sense of justice.
I can
I
see that. That
don't
makes sense to me.
yeah. Yeah, at least that's
Um,
how I see it. That's what I tell myself.
so you bully yourself into things.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
so out of undergrad, you told me this is around 96. You did the undergrad thing. You did a speed run of your undergrad studies, and then
Hmm.
you applied to seminary.
Yeah.
Broad strokes. What's the deal with cemetery,
So,
seminary?
yeah.
What does that look like? What is it you signed yourself up for?
Okay. The basic degree that most ministers get in the Christian tradition is called the Master of Divinity.
Okay.
Um, it is an extremely long degree. If most of them, there may be some shorter ones out there, but we called it the Master of Infinity because it's 98 hours
Okay.
for masters. Usually, masters are in the 30 to 40 range. This is, I'll put it this way: my wife at the time had a PhD, a master's, and an undergrad degree. And when I finished seminary, I had more credit hours than she did, all added up, all with a
Wow.
PhD and a master's, which is a very long degree, 98 hours. That's almost like doing another 4 year. Some guys take 4 or 5 years to do it. A lot of it's because you can't learn Greek and Hebrew overnight. Those are
Sure.
takes a couple of years at least on each of those. And you got all of this Christian history and historical theology, theologies 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's just a lot. It's a like drinking from a fire hose. So yeah, a lot of people don't know that it's a serious degree, and a long degree. So I went out to Los Angeles to a place where I have mixed feelings about it now. It in some ways it's definitely more conservative than I like. In the last few years, I've been more into Episcopal theology and Catholic theology more than Protestant theology, quite frankly. But anyway, but they had a really good language program. Their Greek and their Hebrew was hardcore, and I wanted that. I wanted to get the best grounding, and it helped me because when I got my PhD, my doctorate, I didn't have to take. I tested right out of the languages. You have to know 2 foreign languages with proficiency to get into the program I got into, and I had them nailed. So a lot of
Nice.
students were struggling and having to study French and Spanish and German on the side just to try to get their languages up. And I was like, boom, I got through it. I loved Hebrew. Greek, I like it too, but I love Hebrew. I just it's a Semitic language, which is related to Arabic and Ugaritic and Syriac and Akkadian, and those family of languages. They read backwards, right to left, rather
Right.
than left to right, and they look weird. They're squiggly lines, and you have to learn a whole new alphabet. Greek is it's different, but it's related to English. It's an Indo-European language, we call it, and so it's related to Latin, all the Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, and English and German. So it was. I just didn't like it as much. Hebrews, for one, when you pronounce it, it's beautiful to me. And I think Arabic can be very beautiful sounding. Um, it just it's poetic language, kind of. But anyhow,
How
so yeah.
much how much were you influenced by Indiana Jones and the
Oh,
idea that you could become him?
That was my
Be-
favorite movie of all time. I saw it 100 times. I bet. No, I don't know.
because that's all I hear and see
Yeah,
when you talk about this. I'm like, Steve is Indiana Jones.
yeah. Well, it's funny, but I wrote a memoir about my time in the SEALs and my Christianity, and I have a whole chapter called "Growing Up on Indiana Jones." That's my first chapter. So yeah, he was like my larger than life hero. That's what I want to do. I want to have adventures and study stuff and be a scholar, but go on crazy adventures.
And so you did. You know, they got a new one coming out soon.
I heard something about that.
Yeah, and I guess they're, um, our boy was looking a little bit older in the last one, Crystal Skulls. But I guess I hear they're gonna do some funny, AI overlay
Oh,
stuff, make him maybe
interesting.
look a little bit younger. I don't know. We'll see.
Interesting. Yeah.
Obviously, have to see that. But
Yeah. My
um,
hero.
so you're back in California, Southern California now. You're doing the seminary thing. You talk about its rigor. You talk about how difficult it was. So clearly, it was a challenge there. But were you still excelling? You were,
Yeah.
what was were you keeping your spirits up? At this point, you're you're away from your family, away from
Hmm.
the hometown, back out on your own again. You were managing all that pretty well.
Yeah, pretty well. Well, I was back with Hickson training again because he's in LA.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped me get through it. I'll be honest, seminary was one of the hardest times of my life. I've had a few valleys, and that was a valley.
Mm,
It wasn't the rigor of the curriculum. I did the same as I did in my undergrad. I just flew through it, graduated with honors. But seminary is a weird place. So, and then there's very, very, very many different seminaries. So I'm talking about one specific place. Part of it is the theology that I don't subscribe to at this point in my life. I thought I did then, but I'm like I was seeing holes in a lot of stuff and going,
mm,
huh, doesn't add up. And my best friend Tim Gombis and I met Tim there, and he and I just was up in Grand Rapids hanging out with him a little while ago, and he and I just became fast friends. He's the other reason I survived that place. It was jujitsu and Tim, because we were both curious. We were not satisfied with some of the answers we were being fed, and it was, like I say, a very conservative theology. It was one that it was mean spirited, quite frankly, and it hurt a lot of people. A lot of good people got hurt by it. Some
mm,
people love it and they thrive in it, and that's great. But that wasn't us. We were we were cut out of molds, and there was another guy, Samir, a friend of ours, and he is probably one of the smartest people I have ever met in my life. Genius guy. He's of Indian background, but he's an American, born in America. And Tim and Samir and I all we were seeing the same things, and we all became pretty good friends. Tim and I are like brothers. Samir, he went off and did his thing, and we all ended up going off to get PhDs. Tim at Scotland, and Samir went to Yale and then Duke, and then I went to U of L. So it's funny because we look back and we're like, Tim got me through it, jujitsu, but I guess the hard part of it for me, that why it was a dark time, was because there was a lot of arrogance floating around. And I said religion can be good, but it can also be bad. And the bad part is where a lot of the guys, a lot of the seminary students, and I even struggled with it, was with theology, with being divinity. I mean, who you can't be a master of God. That's very arrogant.
mm-hmm.
I'm getting a master. Divinity just means God, the divine. I'm gonna master God. Who am I kidding? God is mystery. God's complex. God's a million things to a million people. But you get this idea that I've got all the answers, and it can feed an arrogance that is horrible. And I felt it, and I saw it, and I witnessed it around me. And I just wanted to be anywhere. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. It was toxic. And so for that reason, I struggled a lot. I had really a lot of dark thoughts and I almost left it. I almost left seminary and started a whole nother program. But by the time I was considering it, I had so many graduate hours. It would have been really a waste to throw that away. So I figured, well, at least I complete the degree and I'll have it. and I can leave that place behind. So I did basically, and so did Tim. He went off to Scotland to study for his PhD, and I moved back to Kentucky after I graduated.
I can see how that would be tough. I mean, for you in multiple ways, because first off, this is a career path, a professional path that you're charting for yourself,
Yeah.
and you know, the system will say
Mhm.
that you're looking to operate under. You sort of look behind the blinds, right? And you see, wait a second, I'm seeing some problems with this, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem, and a lot of people, I think, a lot of people deal with that. You know, you have a job or a career you think you want, and then you go to become a doctor, medical doctor, and you're like, oh wait, so this is how it really works. You go
Yeah.
into finance. Oh wait, this is how it really works. You're a cop. You're like, oh, this
Right.
is how it really works.
Right.
Um, and that's troubling. But to also have it tied into your faith,
Yeah.
it's like a
Yeah.
double whammy there, right?
Yeah. It's your whole belief system. And that
Yeah,
can be very fragile if you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
yeah.
So yeah, it was a real struggle. I think it is for a lot of guys. I knew a guy before I went to seminary, and he'd done it. He'd done seminary, and he goes, "Yeah, brace yourself because it can be a strange time." He didn't really go into it. I'm like, "What? What do you mean?" It seemed like the greatest thing ever. Oh, study my faith and God and the Bible and all this depth and all of this. Boy, he, some of it is good, and some of it can be a real challenge. Just keep humble and keep kind, and not become arrogant and think you know it all, or well, because you know the Bible better, you're a better Christian than somebody who's, a janitor or a farmer who maybe not even have a high school degree. And you
Hmm.
start, look, I'm up with God. I'm walking around with God all the time. Just ask me, I'll tell you all about it. That kind of thing. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of pastors probably struggle, and I know they do in this regard. My friend Tim has a podcast. We'll throw a nod out to Tim. It's called Faith Improvised. If you're a Christian person and you kind of go, I don't know if I'm making great sense of this, check out his podcast, Faith Improvised, because he really deals with the nitty gritty. And he and I, we've spent a lifetime trying to sort out, let's just leave the bad behind and cling to the good, as we go forward. So yeah, anyway, it was a mixed bag.
So wrapping up seminary, were you still thinking ministry? Were you transitioning to think about, academia? Where were you at that point? And what year is this
Yeah.
by this
So
point?
yeah, right. I graduated in 2000, in May of
Okay.
2000. And I was thinking only about ministry, a pastoral ministry, being a pastor of a church. So I moved back, with my family at the time, a baby daughter and my ex-wife. And we moved to Northern Kentucky. That's where she was from. That's where we met. And um, there was a church, a little country church that needed a pastor, and I didn't really have much direction. It was a little Baptist church in the middle of nowhere. I mean, in the middle of nowhere, and they had about 10 or 13 people in the whole congregation. They couldn't even they couldn't even pay me a full-time salary. I remember my first salary was $10,000 a year.
Well,
Plus, I got to live in the parsonage, the house that the church owned. Well, that doesn't pay the bills. So I got a job teaching school, high school, and middle school. I got my teaching certificate, and I started a lawn care business. So during the spring, summer, fall, I was literally, I drive to school in the morning with my truck and all my lawnmowers on the back in the warm areas of the spring and the fall,
mhm,
and teach all day, leave the school, get in my truck, and cut grass till dark, and like come home, prepare sermons for Sunday, and do whatever I had to do to make to. My wife wasn't working at the time, so it was like, all right. I just worked a lot, but I learned a lot at that church. I learned it really knocked, well, it sure knocked the if I was carrying any arrogance, it knocked that out of my system because it was just real down to earth blue collar people. I mean, they were not they were not educated at all, none of them, other than my ex-wife. And so they couldn't handle a big fire hose of theology. They could handle very simple messages, and they were just simple people. They were great people, some of them the best people I've ever met. Salt of the earth kind of people, hard workers, but they didn't really have any desire for highfalutin anything. They were
They
just
didn't want to. They didn't want an academic lecture. They
no.
just wanted, how should I be better this week than last week? And
Right,
what's my focus area this week? Right.
right. And I learned a lot from those people about people and about expectations and not pressuring people and just loving people for who they are with all their flaws. Not, I think the thing that I don't like most about some forms of Christianity is when any group of people, whether it's elders or a pastor or a priest or whoever, wants to try to look at people as their personal project. Like, I'm going to turn you into X, Y, or Z. No, it's great if you can mentor and feed somebody if they want to go in a certain direction, and you can kind of help that along. But when you got an agenda to change people to fit some mold that's preconceived, is just, it's really not good. It's not right, and it sees people as kind of objects, rather than, no, these are wonderful people to be celebrated in all of their brokenness and all of their greatness. We're all just a walking bunch of contradictions. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so when you start turning people into, you need to do this, you need to be this, you need to talk more like this, my cackles go up, because I'm like, you're there to love them and nurture them, and just stay out of the way. You just bring your messages, and hopefully they're positive. They're not guilt tripping everybody every Sunday. And it's crazy that to think about, on one level, a pastor who, if you're full-time pastor, you're getting paid by the people sitting in those pews who are working their butts in the real world. And I don't know, I hope you're working hard as a pastor, but a lot of pastors I know just sit around in their study all week thinking holy thoughts, and then get up on Sunday and tell people how they need to be different. And it's like, man, that has a real bad ring to it to me. I don't know if you're following where I'm coming from. It's like, you're paying my salary, but I'm going to tell you how you need to be different than you are. Interesting. It can happen. And that's not to take anything away from, there are many loving pastors and that I've met that
Sure.
are really good pastors, and they really care for their flock and want to protect their flock and don't want to get all high-minded like that. But they're both out there. So anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I learned all that to say, I learned a heck of a lot at that little Baptist church in the middle of nowhere. But after 8 years, I just was like, I'm burned out. And for one, we grew, we like tripled, quadrupled in size in my 9 years. I was there 9 years, but it was just getting to be so much of a grind that I was getting fried and burned out. And that right about that time, I started looking at other options, academics, and then the military side of the fence. So
Is this so you finished? Okay, so that's 2000. You said 8 years, so that's like 2000, right? 2000, 2007 ish, 2008
yeah.
um, is when you start to look at
Mm-hmm.
other opportunities. We're drawn to a close here, but September 11th, 2001, you know,
Yep.
um, awakens a lot of things.
Big
Does
time.
the old team guy and Steve get awakened on September 11th? To that, like, what were you, if you can, not to
Yeah.
force you to make it brief, but what were you
No.
doing that day? What were you
Okay.
thinking? What was going through your head?
I was at Summit View Elementary School on that crystal blue Tuesday that everybody remembers, and I was in the classroom with students when we heard something's going down. And I remember just turning the TV. We had a TV in our room, just old school TV, and just turned it right on, and there it was. Yeah, like everybody, you remember it, like you'll never forget where you were and what was going on. And I called my wife uh and just checked in with her, and I I don't know what else I did. I mean, I had to deal with the students.
Right.
We didn't know what to tell them. I mean, some of them are, this was an elementary. No, this was a middle school. Sorry, Summit View Middle School. Yeah. I did teach elementary one year, but that wasn't the year. And a mix of emotions, like everybody. I'm thinking, yeah, the SEALs part of me was like, I want to go now. I want to go back in and join those guys. But but at the same time, I had a family, and it was like, gosh,
Mm-hmm.
who knows? You can't. It was too complicated. I can just drop my family and go back into the SEAL teams. And plus, yeah, they're gonna, like you said in the episode about the Rangers, they're gonna be all right. They've got all kinds of tough guys, and they'll handle it. And I'm not gonna save the world, but I felt like, I felt like I wanted. It wasn't really that. It was more, I want to be a part of our nation's effort against this. So it
Mm-hmm.
was, yeah, it was very emotional, very scary. I remember I'm like, what comes next? Because remember then we're like, our planes just going to start flying into buildings every other day. I mean, the funny thing is, it had never happened again. And I honestly, I mean, it could, but I don't think it will, because now that you get away with that one time, for one thing, the pilot's doors are locked now. Duh, I don't
Right.
know. We never figured that one out. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
the thing though, that I think every time I get on a plane is, anybody tries any monkey business, and they're going to be fighting the whole everybody on that plane. So it's like,
Yeah.
no way. I doubt that would happen again. Now, something terrible with a plane could happen, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, but yeah, but the imagination is, oh my goodness, that was so devastating. Like, I couldn't believe, I still to this day, I can't believe those buildings came down. At first, you're seeing them and you're like, well, that's horrific. There's a
Mm-hmm.
plane just flew into it. But I never thought that whole thing would collapse. Both of them.
Mm-hmm.
I still can't wrap my head around it. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, anyway,
Do you
and the
think
people at the church were flipping out, and I didn't know what to
that's
tell
true?
them. Yeah, and they're like, is this the end of the world? Is this the book of Revelation happening? And I was like, well, I doubt it, but it's not good. So maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
a wake up call that I don't know. I don't know what it's a wake up call. This is just horrible. It's really no words for it, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And is it safe to say that um that moment maybe re-inspired you to think about, well, it sounded like it was a combination of the lifestyle, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
like you gotta take care of your family, right? Resources are thin, limited. You've been doing it for a long time. You're
Yeah.
burnout, not only on like the mental emotional aspect of being a pastor,
Right.
your ministry, but also having to work two other jobs on top of it to keep things going.
Yeah.
September 11th happens. It's got you thinking again about what's going on. Couple wars kick off, you know,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know? And then is that what brought you around finally to chaplaincy?
It was that, but it was more than that. It was, I had stayed in touch with several of my good buddies who are still in the SEAL serving. And they were fighting. They were going down range, and some of them were already had become officers and were commanders then now. And one of them in particular, Rick, he came out. He was from Cincinnati, so I was in Northern Kentucky, and he came. We had lunch and just hung out at my house. And I'm like, "What's going on over there, man? Just give me the scoop." And this was probably around 2006, six ish, 2006 and 2007 maybe. And we'd had some big losses already. The Red Wings, Operation Red Wings, that
Mhm.
terrible loss. And then, and he was telling me about the situation over there, and he was painting a pretty bleak picture, especially about like Afghanistan. He's like, man, he goes, Steve, I honestly don't know what we're doing there. He said, obviously the big targets, the big high value targets, yeah. but he goes, we're never going to change the way these people think. I mean, and he wasn't judging them, but he's just saying it's so different from a democratic, liberal democracy in the West. He goes, it's just guys fighting over space and valleys to grow opium mostly. And he's like, they couldn't find the United States on a globe if their life depended on it. Um, and I that's when I started getting real kind of nauseous feeling about what are we doing there. Not, we can go into that at another point, but he told me, because it coming to the end of, I'm kind of coming to the end of my pastoring, wanting to do
Mm-hmm.
something else, go in a different direction. And he said, Steve, you should come in as a chaplain. He goes, we could use you in the, I don't know if you could get into the teams as a chaplain, but the SEAL teams did have chaplains assigned to not the teams, but to the groups, like
Mm-hmm.
Naval Special Warfare Group 1 on the West Coast, Group 2 on the East Coast. So there were chaplain billets for spec war people. And I'm thinking, man, I don't know. What if they assign me to some chapel at Pensacola Naval Air Station? Then I won't be helping the SEALs. He said, I think you could. I think you could find a way. And I did. That's what was incredible. But he said, we need you. I mean, he said, we just need your spiritual voice and then your background. And he said, the street cred you would have with these guys would be way, way better than some of the goofball chaplains I've met. He said, because I've met some goofballs. And
Sure.
I was like, wow. And that he and I talked to, I think Kevin, and I talked to a couple other people who said, yeah, we're hurting. The teams are hurting. The operators are hurting. The op tempo is killing us. Families are hurting. Please consider this. And those are the
Wow.
voices. Those are the voices that I listened to. And ultimately, I was like, I'm doing it if I can, and I did. I went, well, we'll get into that story, but I got into the reserves because I had just been accepted to a PhD program at the University of Louisville
Mm-hmm.
in 2008. So I had to have something to where I could be there to complete my degree, but I could also serve. And it turned out I served in some pretty big ways, even in the reserves, which
Mm-hmm.
is a parallel universe from active duty, but that's also another story.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap it up,
Yeah.
and for us to pick up right back there when we come back around to your timeline. Um, Thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.
See you.